So this is what we were looking at 3 weeks ago at this point. We used this, as we said, as a benchmark, as a reminder for what was to come in terms of balance tuning coming from Blizzard. We looked at the state of the specs in the midnight beta 3 weeks ago and tried to decide how were the specs looking for the next expansion. Now, this wasn't necessarily talking about who is doing top DPS, who is going to be meta because they are doing top damage in the beta right now, which wasn't nearly as important. What was more important was for the specs to be ready, to be designed nicely, to not really have that many issues mechanically with the spec itself. The best you could have hoped for if a spec was bad was just because of the numbers being low, not because the spec wasn't working. Right? Ask yourself this: would you rather be a poor spec because you miss 3 buttons, you don't have a proper rotation and it feels clunky to play, or would you rather be a poor spec because you do 10% less damage than the others? Well, obviously, the second case is much better to fix. All Blizzard has to do in one of these 4, 5, 6 more sets of tuning we will get before the season releases is buff you by 10% more damage. Meanwhile, in the first case, it's much harder your issue will be solved. It's much harder if the rotation of your spec, the mechanics around your buffs, your procs, the synergy of your hero talents and your talents, etc., are not working. It's much harder to imagine that being fixed, right? That's what we had in mind when we looked at this. And what we want to look by the time the season releases is hopefully for the bottom half to be empty. This is not set up to be spread as a tier list where there are always going to be specs at the bottom. Ideally, we wouldn't want to have specs towards the D and E bottom tiers of this by the time the season releases by the 17th of March. We would rather have complete specs. Then, sure, the complete spec can still be garbage and do terrible damage, but that's about balancing of Blizzard. That's about the numbers that Blizzard tunes. At least we would want to have the spec working in the first place before worrying about the damage or the healing it's doing. So the good news, at the very least, since we said we wanted to only see specs go up in this, is that in the S and in the A tier, in the couple of top results we had when we looked at this 3 weeks ago, none of these specs are going down. None of these are getting worse. They have been, made worse by the decisions of Blizzard. I know we have some terminally complaining kind of player bases, like for example the mages that continue to complain about their specs regardless of their states, but no, Arcane is still doing more than fine and playing still more than fine. It's definitely still ready to be played in the next expansion. Same goes for all the specs in here. Even better, since we have gotten balance tuning recently, we checked on this a couple of days ago, Blood Death Knight now has been buffed in damage. Now they currently have, I think, the 3rd highest AoE damage right now after the buffs they received. Yes, sure, some specs have been nerfed in terms of output. For example, Discipline was nerfed. For example, Demonology was nerfed. Resto Druid was nerfed in Mythic Plus at the very least. But as we said, this didn't have to do with balancing, didn't have to do with tuning. So these specs are still chilling in here. They're still ready, they're still complete, they still have a sense or a reason to exist as a spec, as a rotation, as their toolkit around their talents or their hero talents and how they play. So they're doing fine. What we had below them was the middle pack, the couple of wonders, whether or not it was worth betting on them, how risky it was to put your Hopium tanks into these specs. Quite a few of these specs have received changes recently. We have gotten changes for Survival, for Holy, for Shadow, for Affliction, for all 3 of the Warrior specs. We also had changes for Fire Mage and for Destruction Warlock. So it goes by itself. For starters, the ones we haven't mentioned we can't really give too many judgments on since they haven't really changed too much, like Elemental or like Feral Druid. Yes, true. If anything, it continues to lean down towards Doomium for certain specs because of how much they have been basically ignored up to now. I would say for starters that the changes to Unholy have overall been positive. We have mentioned also that they have changed in the beta their to-go talent setup away from Sun Lane, but that didn't, make the spec worse as a whole. They also got significantly buffed in damage, but again, we're not talking about their power output right now, but they definitely do feel like a complete spec right now. Their switch away from their Festering Wound style into this new pet-based style is working fine. It's a pretty complete and final spec right now to go live in the next expansion. We are going to hesitate putting Affliction any higher. Yes, they have been nerfed recently with Soul Harvester changes, but that wasn't the problem with Affliction. It was more about moving away from Malefic Rapture, but then nerfing over and over and over Unstable Affliction. So now you, again, still have a spender that is somewhat disappointing, especially in single target. We would like to see some changes in there. We can, in good faith, move up Holy Paladin after the whole debacle of the attempt of bringing back Crusader Strike being reverted in 24 hours, plus receiving buffs, buffing even more your Flash of Light, making it even more worthwhile to play. We can give it a bump up in good faith. Who we are going to give a bump down to in bad faith actually are the 2 DPS warriors. We did not like the changes the DPS warriors received in the last round of tuning. It seemed quite aimless from Blizzard, the targeting of the nerfs mixed with buffs they both received, especially Arms Warrior and the nerfing of their single target to buff different AoE abilities. It seemed pretty weird. We're not too big of a fan of these changes, and also this is possibly somewhat of a proxy lack of faith of Prot Warrior, mostly because we saw the interest and the attention Blizzard gave to all of the other tanks, but actually then the changes to Prot Warrior weren't very good. So it makes it feel worse in comparison, especially, for example, Guardian Druid also was buffed by quite a bit, both in their damage and in their tankiness, more so tankiness-wise than their damage, but it was better. We can also, in good faith, try to bring up Fire Mage, although the situation is still not that great. They still have some Pyroblast themed issues. Things were getting so bad to the point where mages were effectively ignoring in execute phase to even click Pyroblast because of how little damage it was doing. Blizzard tried some buff changes recently. They were very minor. They were still doing significantly, drastically less damage than their other counterparts in Mage, but it's getting somewhat better. Still nowhere near acceptable, but we are at the very least now slightly more positive towards Fire Mage. The changes to Destruction were mostly buffs, so their damage output might change, but the whole way the spec plays has not actually changed that much, which is bad right now. So we are not moving them anywhere, much like Elemental Shaman, which was buffed in damage, but not really in all the things they have lost so far in Midnight. What is more important, though, was to get some of these out. Free some of these specs from their doom position at the moment. So actually we're getting worse in here. Resto Shaman is getting even worse than before, because up to this point, Resto Shaman did have Whispering Waves, and then we are getting this recap after they lost Whispering Waves, which has now turned the spec into a rather aimless and pointless kind of healer compared to other healers and their niches, their specialties, what they do best, whether it is spot healing for some of these specs, whether it is still some decent burst healing, whether it is something like Preservation Evoker or Discipline Priest. Resto Shaman without Whispering Waves is kind of just meh, doesn't really fit any category particularly nicely. So since the last time we checked, things have gotten worse for them. They have gotten better for Mistweaver, not by that much. They have been buffed, and also a few of their 45 plus bugs have been fixed, but there's still a long way to go to actually make them feel nice, make them feel positive compared to where they were before. Some damage to their Chi-Ji version and to Jadefair Teachings in the last round of tuning. Yes, it can make the spec better, but we're still ways away from feeling like as good as it used to feel playing Mistweaver even just a season ago in the War Within. Now, Holy Priest did receive a few bug fixes and a blanket set of buffs to their overall healing. The spec, though, still feels on the same dooming angle of Elemental or of Feral Druid, in where they are pressing 3 buttons. If you want to feel luxurious, if you want to feel like you're special, you can play Archon and add an extra button with Prayer of Healing, but still, a lot of your toolkit is all completely automated and happens in the background. You know, when you look at your healing and you notice that Echo of Light and Prompt Prognosis and Ultimate Serenity and Benediction and Cosmic Ripple and Power War Shield and Piety and Binding Heal were all autocast automatically buffs naturally happening from one of your 3 buttons you're pressing, it's a bit too much. When something like 50% of your total healing doesn't even come from you, it's just automatic from other tools in your kit, that's what makes the spec still feels bad, even with the slight improvements it has received in these past 3 weeks. Talking about improvements, well, we can't talk about them for this one because this one got nothing in the past 3 weeks, so it's staying here. There's nothing happening for Windwalker Monk. Now, things have happened for all 3 rogues. At least we got some attention from Blizzard for all 3 of the rogue specs, finally. Now, it wasn't major. There wasn't too much to be positive about. Assassination also got a couple of their talents buffed, whereas for Sub, the buffing was more towards their weaker hero talent, that Stalker. So it wasn't really about their overall much reduced and pruned toolkit, where nowadays you pretty much just have 4 buttons to use as a sub-rogue. So again, they have received some minor improvements, some nice extra slight positive additions, but still nothing big enough to make you feel cool and good about your spec for all 3 rogues. We have to say though that perhaps the one at the very least that feels more complete, we have to set it apart a little bit than the other 2, is Outlaw. We have mentioned this multiple times. Between the 3, the one that was pruned the least, the one that lost the least amount of buttons compared to the others, that still feels like a more complete spec, still working similar to the War Within, has been Outlaw, compared to both Assassination and, even worse, Subtlety. Now, for the Hunters, well, BM was just nerfed in their damage, that's what they got. And Blizzard tried to have a switch of nerfing the played hero talent, which was Dark Ranger, and then buffing the weaker one, which was Pack Leader for BM, so nothing really changing overall for the spec. For marksmanship, things got slightly better because your AoE was made stronger. Across the board, a few of your other talents were buffed, like Aspect of the Hydra or Kill Shot, doing more damage by itself, or Headshot. Still not enough. The pruning that marksmanship received did hurt them quite a lot. The extra cast time on aim shot, the loss of explosive shot has hurt marksmanship by quite a lot. So even these slight damage increases don't really add that much hope to the spec. And the Hunter, we haven't touched his survival. At best, if we were interested in damage, we would have to bring them down, because actually they got nerfed quite significantly in their strongest hero talent, which was Sentinel, which was nerfed by quite a lot in exchange for buffing the opposition Pack Leader, but nothing really that affects the spec and what we have been complaining about, the problems of survival. And then we also had, back then, down here our lovely 2 buttons, our Devourer Demon Hunter, which did receive attention in these last 3 weeks since we updated this. Blizzard did try to buff Reap to make it more useful to press because of the pitiful damage it was doing, as well as tried again to make it worthwhile to actually be pressing your I-Beam, your Void Ray, because of also how useless it was becoming outside of your Metamorphosis. Slight improvement, but not even enough to bring them up. At the moment, it is still feeling quite empty as a spec. I'm sure I know you in live are having even worse problems with the spec, because using your Collapsing Star without your Apex talents feels even worse than it does in the beta. But even when you're in the beta and you get to use your Collapsing Stars properly, it still feels like it is lacking as a spec. Again, possibly by design, as Blizzard likely perhaps wanted to add a new Demon Hunter spec to be simpler, straightforward, etc., but we feel like we are perhaps a bit too much down the simplification line for Devourer, and we haven't really gotten enough positive changes for the spec to feel that improved compared to 3 weeks ago. So this is now the updated comparison to the last time we looked at this. So we went from having 10 specs at the very bottom to only having 7. So it's a slight improvement. But our goal, eventually, it is still to reach the release of the season, the first season of Midnight, without having any of these specs in the bottom 2 categories, and as few as possible in the Doomer category. I'm sure there will still eventually end up being quite a few specs down there, feeling like they have been left out a little bit. But still, the fewer down there, the better. And for now, we still have a few too many of these specs. We are still trying to wait for some improvements about them. So this is what we have for today. Going back to look at how the specs feel and the changes they have received in these past 3 weeks to see the improvements towards as we get closer towards the release of the first season of Midnight. But for today, on this Friday, it is now time to leave each other. We're starting, as usual, our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, the lovely go to sleep, but only sleep for like 3 hours, so you know you have to go to sleep again sometimes today. Great.